The first Gladiator was a pivotal film in my life. Not only did it come out when I was a little boy, as all good movies tend to do, but it was the first film I watched in America. One day after school, my dad took me on a detour from our typical walk home and led me to our local library. To my surprise, we headed right past my favorite fiction aisle and landed in the video rental section. He grabbed this VHS labeled Gladiator, with a Tuscan sun-colored cover donning a young, steel-clad Russell Crowe. Somehow simultaneously in his element and out of place. I also stood there in the now familiar comfort of my library, yet in a city I had never once called home. Crowe was ready for battle, almost daring me to watch the film. And 20 minutes later in our living room, my father unsheathed the tape of what would ultimately become the first movie we ever watched together. My name is Osama, and in many ways, Gladiator served as my intro guide for life in a new country. I was torn from my home and family back in Egypt and introduced to a Western world of promised opportunity. And despite having never picked up a sword, nor led an army, I found similar hope in Maximus' struggle-ridden journey. It showed me that the hand you were dealt didn't necessarily determine the outcome you could create. Within 2.5 hours, Ridley Scott was able to lead a young Egyptian boy through ancient Rome, following a fallen Roman general in a way that also felt both oddly foreign and familiar. Through Maximus Decimus Meridius' rise and fall, and rise again, and fall again, the film transported me to a world I never thought I'd wanted to visit. It was my first time sharing a new hobby with my complicated father. It was my first time truly falling in love with film. Fast forward 2 decades, and here I am, just as in love with movies as I was back then. So much so that I dedicate a lot of my time to discussing them on this channel. So you can imagine when I heard Ridley Scott was making a second Gladiator film, I was filled with the same jittery excitement I once had as a kid. This was my chance to continue the story that began so many years ago in that library. And as an adult with a serious life and responsibilities, it was an opportunity to be transported again to the wonder of movie watching, but this time continuing a story so dear to me. Now, a few months since the film was released, Gladiator 2 sits on relatively mixed reviews, some of which have come from my great friend and channel co-creator Admir. So I've invited him to pick it apart with me and decide once and for all whether Gladiator 2 has left a positive echo in the halls of cinema, or if it will go down as a flop undeserving of its predecessor's title. Welcome to the Our 2 Cents channel, and this is the trial of Gladiator 2. Before we dive in, I want to preface this video by saying Admir and I are both huge fans of the original film, and we've taken on 2 opposing roles to truly put Gladiator 2 to the test here. Admir will be prosecuting the film, while I, holding dearest to the movie that sparked my true love for cinema, will attempt to defend it against those very critiques. You, lovely viewer, will serve as our jury for the duration of this back and forth. Let us know in the comments down below which side you'll be ruling in favor of, and without any further ado, Admir, please take it away.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I didn't want to be here today. I didn't want to tear down the great church of Gladiator that Ridley Scott built, but it seems like the man's ambitions have gotten ahead of him, and I have to do my due diligence as a fan and hold this sequel's feet to the fire. I will propose my 3 main arguments against this film to convince you that it was a mess. The first, plainly put, is that Lucius is a terrible hero. Let it first be noted that none of this slander is directed at Paul Mescal. Discussions have taken place on the interwebs that he was not fit in this role, that somehow he phoned it in. But let us not get caught in the vilification of the man when he was asked to build a cathedral with a hammer and chisel. I ask the jury this: is it not crucial when you watch film or TV that we care about the hero? Consider the countless iterations of Spider-Man we have all borne witness to in the last 25 years. What keeps us coming back to his web-slinging antics? The answer is quite simple. It's Peter Parker, the young fellow behind the mask who embodies all that we are and strive to be. I'd like us to consider Exhibit A in this case, Maximus Decimus Meridius. We meet him as Rome's greatest general, coming off a battle on behalf of the beloved Emperor Marcus Aurelius. After this early battle, we learn that he has been handpicked to lead the Roman Empire back to the Senate as he has not been corrupted by the politics back home. In keeping with his humble persona, he refuses, cementing his image in the eyes of the audience as not only courageous and respected, but to some degree incorruptible and unwilling to seek power. Truly unambitious in the best way. We spent almost 45 minutes getting to know Maximus as a person and the important relationships around him. We feel that we have a true grasp on who he is, what he stands for, and what he wants out of life. So when it does all go horribly wrong, we are left shocked that such a character would be punished so severely by life. When he does set course for vengeance, we're rooting for him. It's revenge for his family and his father figure in Marcus Aurelius, and to some degree, it's also revenge for the Rome that was not to be because of how the events played out. This idea of Rome is quite prominent in both films, and I'll come back to it a little bit later. Nonetheless, this is all to say that at its core, it's our empathy for Maximus that drives our admiration for the character and the film forward. Now, the defendant, Gladiator 2, falls distinctively flat in this department. When we meet Lucius, he appears to be just another commander among the Numidians, his heart devoted to a partner he deeply cares for. When she dies, the moment feels not only terribly rushed, but also overly reminiscent of what befell Maximus in the first film. We spend no time with either of them, together or separately, making her death sad only in the sense that Lucius has lost his wife, rather than because we care about either character. Here's a test for the jury. Do you even remember her name? I mean, she's the reason this whole thing gets going, right? No, you don't. They do mention it in the movie, but no, I don't either. And that's the introduction. That's really all we get to Lucius. We spend no real intimate time with him because from here on, he's thrust into the story as a slave-come gladiator who is always subservient to other characters' whims. Look deep down within yourselves, dear YouTubers. Compare how you felt with Maximus after his intro and how he felt with Lucius after his intro. And before you strike this question down as an objection, suggesting this approach was purposefully taken in order to build the character up throughout the film, I only say perhaps. Perhaps because however true the intention may have been to build up Lucius, the end result is a travesty. We rush through so many key moments of this character. How does he earn the respect of his fellow gladiators? How does he reconcile the dual identities as a Roman and Numidian? Why does he forgive Lucilla for her wrongdoings over the course of one night? All aspects that are skipped over because we have to see extended gladiatorial fights with the most questionable CGI of 2024. And then the real crime of this character is that instead of showing us these aspects, Ridley decides to simply reveal that Lucius is Maximus' son, an hour or so into the film, when much more interesting characters like Macrinus and General Acacius are fighting for the audience's attention. I ask, did we really care about his revenge plot to kill Acacius? No, I'm not sure we did, because the reasons and motives were paper thin. And to make matters worse, Scott believes revealing he's a Nepo baby will somehow get an outpour of sympathy when it does the opposite. Now, before I give the floor back to the defendant, I wish to remind the audience that though there were hints that Lucilla was interested in Maximus in the first film, there was never any indication they had an affair. And to suggest that Maximus cheated on his wife feels utterly revolting considering he moved literal heaven and earth to see her again. We were so invested in what Maximus was doing in the first film. It's what keeps you and I coming back to that story almost 25 years later. Lucius's struggles are muddled in favor of trying to shoehorn a connection to a beloved character. Instead of allowing him to flourish as a standalone, Scott favored building up a subservient character who feels generic and unremarkable. Ask yourself, if you do want to give this film a rewatch, how much of it has to do with Lucius? I yield my time.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my opposition, the prosecution, is right. Without a character to care about, films do become empty and meaningless. That character doesn't, however, need to be the main character. I challenge any of you to honestly tell me that in the Harry Potter films, Harry's the most exciting character. He's relatively flat. His supporting cast fill in the individual personality traits that his character lacks, as he is the classic hero's journey blank slate. The same is true for Luke Skywalker, Forrest Gump, Katniss Everdeen, and Bella Swan, just to name a few. Many films take the approach of a shallower main character in favor of a range of depth within the ensemble characters. Macrinus and Acacius' depth supplant that of Lucius in order to reflect the dueling natures of a fractured Rome. A warring, vicious city that is ruled either by brute force or by loyalty and honor. Lucius is an empty character in comparison because he arrives in Rome as an empty vessel, filled with nothing but shallow disdain for Acacius as the man who conquered his homeland, something he soon realizes was never in Acacius' hands in the first place. This leaves him devoid of any personal quest. And in the absence of that quest, he reverts to the childlike version of himself that cares again about his mother and biological roots in Rome. I will humbly admit, my dear jury, that in screen time, this pivot feels drastic, especially as it seems he goes from hating Lucilla to crying on her shoulders in back-to-back prison scenes. I would like to submit that this, along with the lack of exposition into Lucius and his wife's backstory, whose name was Arishat, by the way, is likely due to scene cuts for a film that is already pushing 2.5 hours long in the year of our Lord 2024. This, I admit, would be inexcusable anyway, as the director is responsible for the final product, but I believe it's fair of my client to drop scenes that build up Lucius's backstory in favor of the development of his future story, especially considering his backstory is nowhere near as fun or relatable as Maximus's. With Maximus, of course we were able to immediately grasp who he is, what he stands for, and what he wants out of life. He was already a decorated general with valor, honor, and personal beliefs well known by the Romans. He had a strong relationship with Marcus Aurelius and thus became a direct rival of Commodus. In a story told through the lens of Rome and its historic evolution, Numidia's Lucius has none of this backstory. He seems unrelatable in comparison to Maximus because he quite simply is. He arrives in Rome as a prisoner of war with no legacy built because he was just a battalion leader who dared to resist the Roman conquest. He quite necessarily has a more generic backstory because he isn't in fact comparable to Maximus. I'd like to instead bring forth Acacius as that character most comparable to Maximus and who provides those missing pieces you're looking for, in ways the original Gladiator film didn't deal with, as it didn't have similarly strong supporting characters. Here, Acacius is also the chosen military leader of Rome. He appears similarly disinterested in politics, just like Maximus, until he realizes the level of corruption driven by Emperors Geta and Caracalla. He even also has a relationship with Lucilla, with whom he requests a break from war to spend time. He seeks to stop fighting and just spend time with his family. Sound familiar? My client, Sir Ridley Scott, is guilty of nothing but casting the brilliant Pedro Pascal in a role with much depth to portray. Acacius needs to represent both the ruthlessness of the Roman Empire in the beginning of the film and the honor and loyalty of his great leaders later on when he sides with Lucius. He possesses that same exemplary moral compass that Maximus once had. On the flip side, Macrinus reflects the cunning ruthlessness that Commodus had in the first Gladiator film. Not only was the great Denzel Washington excellently cast for this role, but the character is by far the most fleshed out in the entire movie. He represents relatable elements of Lucius's humble beginnings as an outsider, Acacius' ability to speak and motivate others around him, and Commodus' ruthless reign by terror. For those still counting, that's 3 jobs, ladies and gentlemen. Scott purposely includes him in the majority of the film's scenes as a vessel for the duality of Rome. He is both politically savvy and terrifyingly violent. In Gladiator 1, Commodus was a leader who, just like Macrinus, knew his limitations and played within them to get what he wanted. Unlike Gladiator 2's twin emperors Geta and Caracalla, Commodus doesn't attempt to kill Maximus early on because he fears that'll turn him into a martyr. I humbly offer this. It was always Mr. Scott's intention to keep the twin emperors as proxy shells for Macrinus' character, as well as filling Lucius' shallowness with Acacius' depth. If it's a crime to build more in-depth characters than just the main hero, then we must lock up many a director. Unlike with Gladiator 1, Gladiator 2 handles a much stronger supporting cast, and while there were certainly some concessions made in the process of juggling them, it isn't as straightforward of a movie as to have a main hero that reflects all the immediately lovable characteristics that Maximus gave us. But if you're still curious, I imagine once there's a third Gladiator film, we'll likely get that version of Lucius that feels much closer to Maximus, now that he'll actually have developed a similar backstory.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'd like to continue by presenting Exhibit B, the profound misuse of the core argument of the film, that Rome is worth preserving. Let us take a step back to the original film. Rome, as presented in Gladiator, is an ideal worth fighting for, an empire that Maximus is willing to sacrifice his life to restore. He fights to depose Commodus, to reinstate the Senate's power, and most importantly, to fulfill Marcus Aurelius' dream of, quote, giving Rome back to the people. But Gladiator never truly examines what this return to Rome signifies. We accept its nobility, not because of a well-reasoned argument, but because Marcus Aurelius has, as some would colloquially say, the juice, and because the alternative, Commodus leading Rome, is just not a great option. So, it was all the more surprising that Gladiator 2 does what its predecessor did not. It engages with the so-called dream of Rome that Marcus Aurelius mentions, but left unexamined, and that is commendable about the sequel. When the credits open, Rome is portrayed as an imperialistic empire, destroying smaller peoples to sustain its thirst for riches and land. It uses slaves claimed from these battles as pawns in their daily entertainment in the walls of the Colosseum and beyond. A true, living, and breathing nightmare. And who better understands this corruption and gluttony but Macrinus? He's as shrewd as he is ruthless, thriving on the empire's violent nature. But more than a mere villain, Macrinus understands Rome in ways that others do not. He recognizes that gladiatorial battles are not mere entertainment. They are a mirror to the Roman psyche. He states, quote, the greatest temple Rome ever built is the Colosseum, because this is what they believe in: power. They gather here to watch the strong strike down the weak. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the true Rome, a society ruled not by virtue, but by brute strength, where violence is not an aberration, but a daily ritual. And there is no end to this nightmare. Gita and Caracalla's relentless conquests show no sign of restraint. The Senate indulges, corruption festers, and slavery and genocide persist as the empire marches forward. If this is Rome, we must ask, what exactly is worth saving? Macrinus provides a clear answer: nothing. He understands that the empire serves only the privileged, and as a former slave, he seeks retribution against a system that once enslaved him. But what of Lucius? As his ideological counterbalance, what is his argument? Quote, a Rome where all could live under fair law and be protected. A Rome of the Senate, a Rome of hope. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the only answer ever given by our hero in shining armor. A Rome valued for what it could be, but not for what it is. An argument built exclusively on potential, and correctly dismissed by Macrinus as the visions of an old man's fantasy, of course referencing Marcus Aurelius. And the film knows that Lucius's argument is weak. That is why it escalates Macrinus's villainy to such an extreme that the audience is left with no choice but to reject him. His plan to burn Rome to the ground is so unspeakably violent that it prevents us from ever fully considering his critiques. Ridley Scott, like so many storytellers before him, simplified the complexity of the debate by making one side so morally bankrupt that the other doesn't even need to answer for their own contradictions. Moreover, for a film purportedly about giving Rome back to its people, it's telling that the people themselves are entirely absent. We don't really hear from them, not as individuals or as a collective. Their voices, their struggles, their desires are mostly ignored. And in doing so, the film weakens the very foundation of its protagonist's cause. If Lucius fails to convincingly argue why Rome is worth saving, the people of Rome could have, and yet they don't. Let's contrast this to an old reliable, The Dark Knight, a film that similarly explores whether a city is worth fighting for and preserving. The Joker presents Gotham as irredeemable, corrupt to its core. But the film does not merely counter him with Batman's idealism, it allows Gotham's people to speak for themselves. Consider the two ferry boats at the end of the movie, where each group of people holds the power to destroy the other. Faced with this dire moral choice, the citizens of Gotham reject the Joker's cynicism. They prove in that moment that Gotham is not beyond salvation. They do what the Roman citizens never do. They demonstrate their worth. So when Lucius ultimately defeats Macrinus and delivers his triumphant speech on Rome's future, I submit to you that his words ring hollow. He does not fight for the Rome that exists, but for a Rome that only exists in imagination. His victory, soaked in irony by the way, reinforces the very principle that Macrinus sought to expose, that in Rome, might makes right. The youthful, stronger Lucius defeats the older Macrinus and claims his throne. Not through reason, not through governance, but through combat. How very Roman of him.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the opposition has accurately stated, the first Gladiator film never truly unravels what the idealized Rome actually represents. I'd like to present the argument that this second film actually does tackle the warring visions of Rome. The beginning of this film intentionally portrays the growing barbarism that is the Roman Empire, especially under two inept emperors who seek nothing but their own bloodlust and their own version of the Roman vision, endless conquest and expansion. I wholeheartedly agree with Mr. Admir that Macrinus carries the entirety of the moral discussion in this film. And I posit that Lucius never intends to until the final act, making it intentionally half-baked. I'd like to unpack the two chronologically, if I may, of course. Before we're ever introduced to Macrinus, Lucius is suffering at the hands of the rapidly growing Roman Empire. He watches his people in Africa Nova die at the hands of his previous peoples. This is a metaphorical wiping of the slate for Lucius and his emotional ties to either land. The human manifestation of this is Acacius. He arrives as the harbinger of death for Lucius, and the film intentionally showcases him as pure evil in the first battle scene. With Acacius comes the mighty hand of the Roman Empire. However, soon in Rome we see how much this wears on him. As a military general, he fights in the name of Rome, but doesn't truly believe in the cause he's fighting for. He carries the moral dilemma that plagues Rome. Do I fight in the name of my emperors and for honor in growing this empire, or do I do what I feel is right and end the unnecessary conquest and bloodshed? To him, Rome has always been politically savvy and honorable, and to him, all of that honor has died within the time we've transitioned from Marcus Aurelius to Geta and Caracalla. In the viewers, our eyes, he quickly goes from representing the might of Rome to its honor, something that becomes even more prevalent throughout the film, especially as we come to see his honor move the people of Rome more than the entertainment of the Colosseum itself. At this point, Lucius stands for nothing other than to take down all in his sight. That, my dear honorable jury, is the very tragedy of Lucius. He begins to embody the same wrath Rome has come to stand for. He serves no moral addition to the film until he gradually develops one in the third act. On the flip side, we are very soon introduced to Macrinus, who has clear motivations and takes Lucius under his wing to serve those very ambitions. As the prosecution clearly alluded, Macrinus is an older version of Lucius, but one who had no ties to the Roman Empire and became subject to it against his will. He and Lucius have a moment to reflect on this when Lucius accuses him of not being from around here. They silently acknowledge the fact they've thus far been on the same path, but Macrinus has taken his understanding of Rome and leveraged it as a business tool. He quite literally uses Rome's violent desires to grow his riches, with his very own inside man in Lucius. Macrinus himself begins to paint a slightly different picture of Rome, one that is indeed debased and violent and cruel, but also one that can be cunning and wise. He represents the Roman Republic dream. A man with nothing can become something if he plays his cards completely right, including making often immoral choices. Macrinus is evil, political, savvy, and diplomatic. All aspects every single one of us has come to learn are true of the Roman Empire. The true issue to him is that, under the current emperors, it has lost its cunning savviness. He balances his violence with logic as he states his vision for Rome, one that is always ruled by the strongest. He's tired of seeing weak men reign with no true physical or mental power. In all his days from a slave to a businessman, he has come to learn that the most common denominator in success is that the strongest will and force will always prevail. Ladies and gentlemen, he is the version of Lucius that would have arisen had he taken his wrath to its fullest extent. Instead, Lucius's encounters with both Acacius and Lucilla, despite being rushed and half-baked, lead him to take a moral stance that is finally different from Macrinus's. Like I mentioned earlier, it isn't until seeing Rome's leaders turn against their most honorable, Acacius, that Lucius really learns how evil this place is, and decides to shift his goal from personal vendetta to collective salvage, something I'd like to come back to in a few. It's also in this moment that we do, in fact, dear trusted members of the courtroom, see the people of Rome in fact come to life to make a moral choice. I object to my opposition's claim that the citizens of Rome don't make a clear choice in this film. We consistently see them side with Acacius, now clearly the moral center of the film, and it leads to their rebellion when he's murdered in the Colosseum. They watch as Acacius' honor is transferred to Lucius when the latter wins the fight and spares his life. This is a moment that encapsulates the citizens' vision of Rome, that democracy prevails. As barbaric as the Colosseum is, there's always still this glimmer of hope for anyone who enters it, and if they prevail, they're rewarded. When Acacius is killed though, the citizens see how both he and Lucius are wronged in this scenario, and their idea of the Roman vision is simply shattered. It leads them to rebel against the empire and fight the guards in the Colosseum. The very same guards and military who later agreed to a ceasefire because their hearts were always with the citizens. Now, as promised, I'd like to come back to Lucius' decision to shift from personal vendetta to salvaging the Roman Empire. You would be correct, my friends, in claiming that he truly wouldn't stand for anything in this case. He only stands against the vision of Rome that he's seeing, rather than having his own unique vision. And I'd argue that's completely okay. He is a man who is just arriving in Rome again as an adult, and as such wouldn't have any real personal equity to draw on to develop a unique vision for what Rome should be. Yes, he played the Kamala Harris card of just coming in at the end and saying things need to be different without offering a concrete vision of how, but so what? Isn't that very clearly better than Macrinus' vision? And isn't it suitable for his lack of experience? My point, simply put, is such. Lucius was never portrayed as a wise person. He doesn't carry the moral dilemma for the majority of this movie, instead allowing Acacius and Macrinus to do so. The people of Rome do in fact make their decision, and that is what leads to the stalemate end to the film. One I was actually happy to see, as a civil war would have felt really out of place. How very not Roman of them.
Ladies and gentlemen of YouTube, it's been 25 years. 25 years since Russell Crowe donned the infamous steel mask that would sear itself into the DNA of movie culture. 25 years since we all welled up listening to Lisa Gerald's We Are Free carry Maximus through the fields of wheat and grain to his family in the afterlife. And 25 years since we saw a general become a slave and a gladiator who defied an emperor. And that brings us to Exhibit C, the indulgences of Ridley Scott. Look, art doesn't need a reason to exist. If a creator wants to create, we should all get behind that, especially someone like Ridley Scott. However, when you go back to such a beloved film, your reasonings and timing for doing so need to be bulletproof impeccable, because you are taking something that people have loved for a very long time and changing it in front of their eyes. It needs to be done with intention and care. In a November 2023 interview with Deadline, Scott was asked what interested him enough to come back for a sequel, with him responding, quote, "Well, economically it makes sense. That always begins there. I thought the first film was, as it were, completely satisfactory, creatively complete, so why muck with it, right? But these cycles keep going on and on and on. They repeat globally for the last 20 years. It started to spell itself out as an obvious thing to do, and that's how it evolved. Going back and upending what was a complete story for the sake of reflecting our time is not enough of a reason. Gladiator wrapped up incredibly well, and all of the film's momentum ended in the arena with Maximus and Commodus both seeing out their fates. It was never built to sustain a franchise, and it was all the better for it. Scott, the cast, and all involved gave it all they had in their first and only go. But now, we find ourselves with the sequel that tries to resurrect old mythology and revive a smattering of random characters to get us to feel something, but ties with its predecessor about as tightly as a kindergartner's shoelaces.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, again, my friend here is right. There was no need for this movie to be made. Just the same as there was no need for the first movie to be made, at the risk of sounding facetious, of course. My client, Mr. Scott, whether you like him or not, seems to be a rather spontaneous man, a true creative driven by his very impulses. In a similar 2024 interview with Deadline, Scott, when asked where his ambitious appeal comes from to make films at 87 years old, says, I quote, "I feel alive. I feel I'm getting into a Formula One car and driving away. And I like being in the Formula One car. Ladies and gentlemen, the guy is an enigma, who clearly lives by the beat of his own drum no matter how eccentric. He even responded to the question of how he decided on Denzel Washington for Macronus with, quote, "Because I'm fucking good at casting, dude. Have you noticed? Remember Brad Pitt in Thelma and Louise? I'm pretty good." This isn't dissimilar to his approach for the first Gladiator film. In fact, that film was born when a screenwriter named David Fransoni traveled across Europe and became fascinated with the Roman Empire. After reading the ancient Roman text Historia Augusta, he chose to center the story on Commodus. And in trying to sell the story to Mr. Scott, DreamWorks producers showed him a copy of Jean-Léon Gérôme's 1872 painting Pollice Verso, which Scott said portrays the Roman Empire, quote, "in all its glory and wickedness." Apparently, he was so captivated by the image that he immediately agreed to direct the film. When Parks pointed out that Scott didn't really know anything about the story, Scott replied, "I don't care, I'll do it." The entire franchise seems to have been created on his whim, and that's what made him the right director for it. In fact, the iconic wheat field scene that we've all come to learn and love in the first film came as a result of Ridley Scott famously chasing Russell Crowe's stand-in out of the wheat field where he was smoking a cigarette and would have burnt it all down. And after seeing his hand gliding over the wheat, he rolled the cameras and created one of the most iconic images in film history. I will say though, even though the motivation behind a film could be that the director just wanted to make it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it should be. In that same 2024 interview with Deadline, Scott was also asked about the decision to showcase this more cynical and cruel reality of Rome. And he responded that, quote, "It's an iteration of what the fuck is happening today right in front of us. Every time I switch on CNN, there it is, dude. Some asshole is territory hunting and shouldn't be, and has no right to have that. Therefore, it would seem to be a good beginning to touch on present day politics and terrible actions." I'll admit, it certainly isn't the most sophisticated reflection of modern politics, nor is it the most unique iteration of a sequel, but I'd argue the need for this film was born of the same desires that powered the first one to success. A man driven by his imagination to create a story that gave a slightly different perspective to its predecessor.
Members of the jury, as you sit there with glistening eyes on the youtube.com, I ask you to consider what was said here today. We all agreed that watching Lucius go through his journey was about as interesting as watching grass grow. We've all agreed that the reason for getting a sequel off the ground had less to do with the story itself and more to do with the whims of a genius who is slowly developing a losing record against Father Time. Let us not become slaves to fandom or fall prey to rose-tinted glasses of yesteryear in order to justify artistic missteps in the present. We can hold both truths in our hand, that Gladiator is an impeccable piece of cinema and that its sequel stinks. They can be and are mutually exclusive. What is also mutually exclusive is how right I am and how wrong Osama is. There is indeed no overlap there. To him now, I give the floor to take us home.
My dear friends of the jury, I implore you to find the child within you that enjoyed the wonder of film. The one that recognizes that this medium of art serves more than to constantly superficially supersede itself with meaningless measures of competition. The very child, like my inner one, that fell in love with film in the first place. This film adds a unique take to the existing Gladiator storyline. It weaves in a larger, more intricate cast of characters into a similar world. Sure, it doesn't have the strongest protagonist, and yes, it isn't as original as its predecessor, but it makes up for both by creating a whole that is larger than the sum of its parts. I left the movie theater thoroughly entertained after watching Gladiator 2, and I know in my heart that you did too. Do not judge this film for what you or critics wanted it to be. Judge it for what it is and does. And to my dear friend and prosecutor Admir, I humbly submit that first is in actuality the worst, and second is the best. This movie was great, you suck, and I won this. All jokes aside, if you've watched this long, sincerely from the bottom of our hearts, thank you for watching. I'm really curious to see your comments down below of which side you would be ruling in favor of. And also while you're down there, let us know if you enjoyed this type of content because we certainly enjoyed making it. And also while you're there, hit those subscribe and notifications buttons because it really does help us out a ton. From all of us here on the Our 2 Cents channel, peace and goodbye. We'll see you in the next video.